Why do some nations rise to greatness while others remain stuck in poverty and turmoil? Is it their leaders, their land, or something far deeper? Across centuries, the same patterns repeat, shaping the destinies of entire civilizations. But what if we've been looking at the wrong reasons all along? Why Nations Fail by Daron Acemoglu and James A. Robinson dives deep into the forces that determine why some nations prosper while others stagnate, offering stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about power, wealth, and progress. What makes one nation thrive while another collapses into poverty and stagnation? The answer lies not in geography or culture, but in the rules of the game, the institutions that shape how a society operates. Institutions are the invisible frameworks that determine who holds power, who gets a seat at the table, and who benefits from the wealth created in a nation. The most critical distinction? Whether these institutions are inclusive or extractive. Inclusive institutions are like open doors. They create systems where opportunities aren't reserved for an elite few, but are accessible to a broad range of people. They empower individuals to participate in politics, start businesses, own property, and innovate. A good example is the early United States. After its independence, the country set up institutions that protected property rights, enforced contracts, and allowed citizens to vote and hold their leaders accountable. This wasn't perfect or equal for everyone. Slavery and systemic inequality still existed. But the framework was there to expand opportunities over time. With property rights and a fair legal system, farmers could invest in their land without fear of losing it. Inventors could patent their creations, knowing they'd benefit from their work. Entrepreneurs could take risks, start businesses, and compete in an open market. This widespread access to opportunity created a ripple effect. When people know their efforts will be rewarded fairly, they work harder, think bigger, and push boundaries. The result? Sustained economic growth and innovation. Now let's look at the opposite: extractive institutions. These systems are designed to concentrate power and wealth in the hands of a small elite. They extract resources, both natural and human, for the benefit of a few, leaving the majority with little incentive to innovate or contribute. Colonial Latin America under Spanish rule is a textbook example. The Spanish crown established an extractive system where wealth from gold and silver mines flowed straight to the elite, while indigenous populations were exploited as cheap labor. There was no opportunity for upward mobility or economic participation for the majority. The result? A system that created short-term wealth for a few, but left long-term stagnation for the many. Extractive institutions don't just harm economies. They crush human potential. When people are denied the chance to improve their lives, they stop trying. Innovation dries up. Progress stalls. Entire nations become trapped in cycles of poverty and inequality that can last for generations. What's fascinating is how institutions can change the trajectory of nations. Take Botswana and Zimbabwe, two African nations that started their post-colonial journeys with similar challenges but ended up on dramatically different paths. Botswana, after gaining independence in 1966, established inclusive institutions that prioritized good governance, property rights, and transparency. Leaders like Cyrus Kama worked to ensure the country's diamond wealth benefited the broader population rather than being siphoned off by a corrupt elite. Over decades, Botswana became one of the fastest-growing economies in the world, transforming its natural wealth into widespread prosperity. Zimbabwe, on the other hand, fell into the trap of extractive institutions. After independence in 1980, land and resources were concentrated in the hands of political elites. Corruption, political repression, and policies like land seizures destabilized the economy, leading to hyperinflation, poverty, and a dramatic collapse in living standards. The difference highlights how inclusive institutions can transform potential into progress, while extractive ones can squander even the most abundant resources. Institutions are the real game changers, determining whether a nation's wealth benefits everyone or just a select few. The lesson here is clear. Inclusive institutions don't just drive economic success. They create a sense of shared destiny. When people believe they have a fair shot at success, they are more likely to invest in their future and the future of their nation. This isn't just about money. It's about trust, collaboration, and the belief that progress is possible for everyone, not just the privileged few. If inclusive institutions are the foundation of prosperity, extractive institutions are the architects of failure. These systems concentrate power in the hands of a small elite who use their position to exploit the rest of society. What makes extractive institutions particularly destructive isn't just their oppressive nature. It's how they perpetuate themselves in a vicious cycle, ensuring inequality and stagnation for generations. Extractive institutions are built to benefit a select few at the expense of everyone else. Those in power design the rules to maintain their dominance, often relying on force, manipulation, or fear to silence dissent. This creates a feedback loop. The elite hoard resources, use those resources to consolidate more power, and then further tighten their grip on society. As long as the system benefits them, there's no incentive to change. But the damage doesn't stop there. Extractive institutions create instability by fostering resentment and inequality. History shows that when the majority of people are excluded from power and wealth, social unrest is inevitable. Revolutions, coups, and uprisings are often born from the frustration of living under extractive systems. However, these movements rarely result in long-term change because they often replace one elite group with another, continuing the cycle of exploitation. A stark example of this is the political turmoil in many post-colonial nations. Colonial powers left behind extractive systems designed to exploit resources. And when these nations gained independence, the new leaders often inherited and perpetuated these systems instead of dismantling them. Instead of creating inclusive institutions, they used the same tools of exploitation to maintain their own power. Breaking this vicious cycle is incredibly difficult. It requires not just removing the elite, but completely overhauling the institutions that uphold their power. This is why many nations struggle to transition from extractive to inclusive systems. Those in power resist change because it threatens their position. The lesson is sobering but essential. Extractive institutions don't just harm individuals. They trap entire nations in a cycle of inequality, stagnation, and instability. The only way forward is to replace them with systems that distribute power and opportunity more broadly, allowing societies to unlock their full potential. One of the most powerful drivers of prosperity is the ability to create, destroy, and rebuild. This concept, known as creative destruction, is essential for long-term economic growth. It's the idea that societies progress by constantly reinventing themselves, by allowing new ideas, industries, and technologies to replace the old. However, this process can only happen in environments where inclusive institutions thrive and where the elite don't stand in the way of change. Take the Industrial Revolution as an example. In Britain, the rise of factories, machinery, and new technologies disrupted centuries-old agricultural systems and manual labor. While this caused immense upheaval, it also spurred innovation, created new industries, and provided new opportunities for people across social classes. The old industries, such as traditional farming or handcrafts, couldn't compete with the new wave of mechanized production. The result? New wealth was created, new skills were developed, and the standard of living improved for many. However, creative destruction isn't a smooth or easy process. It creates winners and losers, which is why inclusive institutions are vital for making sure that the costs of change are distributed fairly. When the old ways of doing things are upended, there are always groups that lose out, whether it's workers in old industries or elites who benefit from the status quo. If these groups are left out in the cold, resentment builds and social unrest can follow. This is where extractive institutions fail. They concentrate power in the hands of a few, and those in power have a vested interest in preventing creative destruction. For instance, in places where political elites control industries or monopolies, they often resist new ideas and innovation because it threatens their wealth and power. The rise of new technologies, industries, or markets could undercut their dominance, so they actively suppress it, In this sense, extractive institutions act as a roadblock to progress. An example of this can be seen in the Soviet Union. The centralized command economy and rigid institutions stifled technological innovation. The elites controlled every aspect of the economy and had little incentive to embrace change. Despite early successes in industrialization, the lack of creative destruction and innovation led to economic stagnation and eventual collapse. The Soviet Union simply couldn't keep up with the more dynamic economies of the West, which embraced innovation and allowed new industries to emerge. Inclusive institutions, on the other hand, encourage innovation. They don't just allow creative destruction to happen. They make it the driving force behind growth. When societies are open to new ideas and allow for competition, creative destruction leads to an explosion of innovation that can fuel prosperity for generations. The technology boom in Silicon Valley is a prime example of how an inclusive system of education, open markets, and intellectual property protection leads to constant reinvention. Nations that embrace creative destruction foster an environment where progress can thrive. Inclusive institutions allow new ideas to flourish, old industries to transform, and society to constantly reinvent itself. While the process can be painful and disruptive, it's the only way to sustain long-term growth and avoid stagnation. Without it, societies risk becoming trapped in outdated systems, unable to adapt to the challenges of the future. A nation's success isn't just about its economic policies. It also depends heavily on how power is organized and wielded. Political centralization is a critical factor in ensuring stability and progress. But what exactly does this mean? Political centralization refers to having a strong, organized, and unified system of governance capable of enforcing laws, maintaining order, and managing resources effectively. Without centralization, chaos reigns. A fractured political system, where power is scattered among competing factions, often leads to instability, corruption, and inefficiency. However, centralization alone isn't enough. It must go hand in hand with inclusive institutions to create a system that works for everyone, not just the ruling elite. History offers countless examples of how the lack of political centralization has derailed nations. Take Somalia, for instance. For decades, the country has been plagued by weak governance, warlordism, and factionalism. The absence of a central authority to enforce laws or protect citizens has created a vacuum where corruption and violence thrive. Without a unified system to manage resources or implement policies, progress remains out of reach. On the other hand, over-centralization in extractive institutions can be equally disastrous. Nations with highly centralized but oppressive systems, such as North Korea, funnel all power to a small elite while denying any meaningful participation to the rest of society. The result is a rigid, top-down structure that suppresses innovation, stifles dissent, and exploits the population for the benefit of a few. The key to success lies in striking a balance. Effective political centralization provides the structure and stability needed for a nation to function, while inclusive institutions ensure that power is distributed and used to benefit the majority. A great example of this balance can be seen in the United Kingdom during the Glorious Revolution of 1688. This event marked a turning point in British history, as it limited the power of the monarchy and shifted authority to a more inclusive parliamentary system. The result? A politically centralized state with inclusive institutions that laid the foundation for centuries of economic and political growth. Political centralization also plays a vital role in fostering trust and cooperation. When people trust their government to uphold the rule of law and protect their rights, they're more likely to participate in the system, whether that means paying taxes, starting businesses, or voting. This trust creates a virtuous cycle, where strong governance leads to a stronger society, which in turn supports better governance. Sometimes, history isn't a slow, steady march. It's shaped by sudden, pivotal moments that change everything. These moments, known as critical junctures, are periods of upheaval or opportunity when the rules of the game can be rewritten. Whether nations rise or fall often depends on how they respond to these turning points, and whether their institutions adapt to seize the moment or cling to outdated systems. A critical juncture is like a fork in the road for a nation. It's a moment when existing structures are shaken, and there's an opening for change. This might come in the form of a revolution, a war, an economic crisis, or even the arrival of a groundbreaking technology. What happens next is crucial. Will the society use this moment to build more inclusive institutions, or will it double down on extractive ones? One of the most striking examples of a critical juncture is the Black Death in 14th century Europe. This catastrophic plague wiped out nearly half of Europe's population, creating massive social and economic upheaval. In the wake of the crisis, labor became scarce and peasants in many regions began demanding better wages and rights. In Western Europe, where institutions were more flexible and inclusive, the elite were forced to adapt. Feudal systems began to break down, paving the way for the rise of wage labor and eventually capitalism. But the story wasn't the same everywhere. In Eastern Europe, elites doubled down on extractive systems. Instead of granting more freedoms, they tightened their grip on the peasantry, leading to the entrenchment of serfdom. Two regions faced the same crisis, but their responses shaped radically different futures. Critical junctures are also evident in more modern times. The end of World War II was a critical moment for many nations. While Western Europe rebuilt itself on a foundation of democratic and inclusive institutions, much of Eastern Europe fell under Soviet influence, where extractive systems of governance took hold. The difference in their trajectories, economic, political, and social, can still be seen today. But critical junctures are not just about the decisions made by elites. They're also shaped by the voices of ordinary people. Mass movements, protests, and grassroots initiatives can push societies toward inclusivity. For instance, the civil rights movement in the United States was a critical juncture that forced the nation to confront its systemic racism. While the struggle is far from over, the movement led to significant legal and institutional changes that expanded rights and opportunities for millions. The lesson here is that critical junctures are rare but powerful opportunities to reshape the future. They're moments when societies can choose a path toward inclusivity and progress, or fall back into the trap of extractive systems. The choices made during these moments don't just affect the immediate generation. They can set the course for centuries to come. Understanding this dynamic is essential for anyone looking to change the world. It reminds us that history is not inevitable. It's shaped by the decisions we make at key moments. And when those moments come, the stakes couldn't be higher.